Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch, myself, Roland Hume, chats some interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. And today we are delighted to have a very special guest with us, Mary Carroll Moore, who is a best-selling author, has written 12 books in 3 genres, and she is here today to talk to us about a subject which I think is going to be really interesting, which is multi-layered scenes. And I just watched a bunch of Frasier episodes, and they have these wonderful scenes where you have different characters, and they each have different stories going on within the same scene. So it's something I'm quite excited to hear about. So Mary, thank you very much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. Thank you all. This is a great topic.
Oh, well, we are delighted to have you. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing well. I'm doing better than you. You're a little bit sick, so hopefully everyone will give you some latitude if you're fading.
Exactly. I have the Rona, so everyone listening to this, Lysol down your headphones, Lysol down your phone afterwards.
We're really excited to have you here, Mary. And one of the things, I know you've taught writing around the world, and one of the things I thought was interesting is that you've written some cookbooks. You went to a culinary academy, or you wrote them for the culinary academy. I've always wondered about cookbooks and whether or not when you put one together, are you sort of like grabbing recipes from other sources, or are you like in charge of creating brand new recipes that you're building in a test kitchen or something?
I have to do them all. Every book I did, I had to do them all. I would get inspiration from other writers and other authors in the cookbook field, but part of my contracts was always, these are original, and they're, how many times can you talk about how to cook a steak? I don't know, but so there's going to be some layover from other people, but no, they're original. All tested.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. Like I couldn't, I can't cook without a recipe. I can't even imagine, right? But then I guess, as you said, that things are so little. So maybe if you change something from half a cup of sugar to a quarter cup of sugar, well, it's a new recipe.
Yeah, it is. Well, it changes it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Chemistry. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but anyway, that's just my personal interest. But today we are going to be talking about sort of creating complex layered scenes within your story. And this is something that I think you talk about in when you give your own talks and other sources. So you know a lot about it. First of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started, and
Sure.
what you sort of talk about and all that when you do your rounds.
You started it off. I was a food journalist for a long time, 2 decades. I started out working in a restaurant, and then I had a cooking school in California for a number of years, and it got some good mentions in USA Today and other big media. And so I got asked to start working with cookbooks, and I did. I've actually done 11 cookbooks, something like that, something outrageous. And then I was asked to be part of the LA Times syndicate. So the LA Times syndicated my cooking column for almost 12 years. But then I decided, if I had to die tomorrow, what would I really like to do with my writing? And that took me to fiction. So I went back to school, got my MFA, and I have 3 novels now. One's going to be published next spring, and one just came out. So it's been a fun and wild ride being in the fiction world after being in a very, very nonfiction world.
Yeah, I imagine that's a big difference. So I guess when you create complex layered dishes, it's similar to how you create complex layered scenes, right?
Yes, great analogy. Yes, and actually that was one of the requirements of some of the books I wrote for the cooking industry, was that they had to be gourmet and really complex and like take hours. So there you go.
It's interesting. You think about like genre fiction, though. Genre fiction is almost like a recipe. It's like if you have a small town romance, you've got to have a small town, and then you like sprinkle on your flannel wearing handymen and your big city girls and all of these different things that are essential ingredients for that particular book and that particular genre to rise and be delicious.
It's true. I also think that if you're talking about complex scenes, you have to have the element of surprise. So in cooking also, readers would comment that, oh, this turned out quite differently than I expected, and that was great, and everybody loved it. So the same thing with books. I think you have to have that element that no one really expects. They can anticipate it, but it's not expected in the way that, oh, this is so predictable. So yes, I don't like the cookie cutter approach to writing anyway. I like the more, I'm surprised. You know, if I'm surprised, then the reader's going to be surprised too. And that really satisfies me as a reader.
And I mean, I know that your latest book is a thriller. What were the other ones?
Well, the one before that was a young adult kind of romance. It's about a young girl who causes an accident with her younger brother one summer on a lake, and he goes into a coma, and the same summer she falls in love. So it's kind of about deserved happiness. If you do something terrible, can you be happy? And then this one that just came out is about women pilots. And it's a literary thriller because, as my agent told me, I'm not really a thriller writer. I'm more of a women's fiction writer. So I write about relationships more than I write about the thrill part of thrillers. But there is search and rescue and a plane crash and a bad guy chasing someone who's trying to run from the law. So I guess you got all the thriller aspects there.
That sounds pretty thrillery to me.
Yeah, I know. I think people that like thrillers like that aspect. And then there's another group of people that are not as crazy about being with the bad guy in every scene. So they like the relationship aspect.
Right. And then, I mean, because you had mentioned that complex scenes would have an element of surprise. And if you're writing a thriller, I can see why, you know, that would definitely be the case. But in other genres, is that still a requirement? So like, let's talk through what goes into it, what you mean by a complex scene so that people understand and we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah. Well, this is my view, of course, from years of teaching and writing myself, but everybody will have their own idea of what complex means. To me, there's a couple of ingredients in a complex scene. The first thing would be that the plot has some turning points or twists that are not expected. It's kind of like you can go along the train track a certain way, but then there's going to be an obstacle that maybe you don't expect. So that makes it complex versus predictable. And I'd say those are the two opposite extremes. And the second element is character arc. So we've got the plot arc, the character arc, the arc of the characters. I think that complex characters tend to face big questions like moral ambiguity. They face something more than, oh, can I fall in love, or can I win this game, or can I kill this person? You know, there's something in deep and in their depths that's more complicated, I guess, more not easily answered. And so I tend to go that way in my own books. I tend to write the questions that can't be answered with a straight yes or no, that there is that gray area. And that makes complexity in character, because you end up reading the book and you like the character perhaps, but you end up with a question about, well, did they do the right thing? Or what would happen if they did this? So in my mind, that makes complexity. And then the third element in complex scenes is usually setting, where the setting itself becomes something of a character in that it influences decisions. I mean, beyond weather, there might be terrain that's not necessarily friendly to the protagonist, and those kinds of things make it complicated. So I think that the combination of these three elements is what I found to be a little bit of a recipe for complex scenes. So checking all three of those, I do it on a storyboard like filmmakers use, and that way I can kind of verify for myself objectively, how does this work? Is it tracking well, and all three elements present and accounted for?
Wow. That's quite a lot to put into a scene. So I imagine not every scene has to be complex.
No, I wouldn't make them all complex. You know, you have the simple ones too, but I think, you know, I'm looking at the whole book sometimes and I'm thinking, okay, of the percentage of scenes, are they complicated enough to drive something forward? You know, do they have a big question at the end, or do they wrap things up too much? I think that's what my MFA program did for me, is the idea that I needed to not wrap things up too much. That makes them more complicated.
Right. And so are you sort of aiming for like a certain, you know, amount of complexity I mean, you know, the scenes don't necessarily translate to chapters, but I guess, you know, you might have chapters that are, you know, that are sort of lighter, I guess, and some of that are more complex, so that sometimes, you know, you don't want to overwhelm the reader and make them, you know, exhausted by the time they get through the book, if everything's complex and they're all, you know, their head is spinning by the end of it, right?
Right. It's true. But I think for me, I get the most out of, like, I was thinking about literary thrillers, which tend to have a combination of the literary, meaning the relationship of the characters, and the thriller aspect, which is, of course, the plot. And I tend to like a little bit of both in each scene, so that I'm definitely involved with the characters. That's the biggest compliment I've gotten from readers of Women's Guide to Search and Rescue, which is my current book, that they feel invested in the characters so much that they don't want to let them go at the end. And I've gotten so many requests for sequels now from people that I couldn't imagine would like the book in the first place, but they did, and they want more. That means to me that the characters were intricate enough to not be answered really quickly. Like, they're not just this kind of person, and then, they end up this kind of person, but they're struggling inside, and they're not completely resolved at the end, maybe. So, I agree with you that not all the scenes have to be that way. It's a relief to have a little simple scene, like somebody's hiking in a forest, and you don't throw in a lot of stuff there. You just have them hike, But at the same time, I want to know what's happening inside the person as they're hiking. I don't want them to just be on the plot level, but also I want the character to come forward and reveal something, like something they're struggling with. And that makes me interested. That
How
might
do you
be
approach that?
How do I approach that? Storyboards mostly. I do it all on the wall because I can't trust my computer. When I get 300, 400 pages of a story in there, it becomes like a mess, and I can't follow it. But I do this storyboard on the wall with sticky notes, those Post-it notes.
Oh,
and I rearrange them. Yeah. So a lot of people just save the cat, or there's lots of methods to organizing a story. But my whole thing would be to objectify it, make sure that I don't drop anybody, and that people are in a scene for a reason, and they actually contribute some forward motion. I mean, this is not probably new to your listeners at all, but that's something that a lot of writers that I've taught and coached and edited over the years, they lose people and they lose the point of the scene. So that's what the storyboards keep me honest.
I think it's funny. That's something we keep hearing again and again, the more people we talk to, and especially it seems to be something that the more successful people, that's advice they follow. It's very, like, a lot of people, myself included, have trouble following that advice, but it does seem very valuable.
It's hard, though. You're right. I mean, I think structure is one of the things that people either abhor or they're too involved in, and then too structured is like you lose the art, but too unstructured, you got nothing but art, and it's not, nobody can follow it. So it's a useless piece of literature to me. So I find, things I've edited, for instance, people who start their actual story in chapter 5 or 6. So the first 4 chapters are kind of just preamble, getting the writer warmed up. Well, that would be totally apparent on a storyboard. You couldn't hide from it. But within a document on your computer, you can get involved in the words and the prose and how great it is, and then you lose it. So the storyboard really does objectify it, keep it honest.
Yeah, we recently had a discussion with an author on here about making that the beginning of your story, bring the reader in, hook them in, and not start with a whole bunch of prose that it's going to lose the person before they really get invested in the story.
Yeah.
Which is also very key. So, I think one thing to make sure that people are aware of, and you've been mentioning it sort of offhand, but the complexity can be both internal and external.
Yes.
Right. So I think that at the beginning we were sort of saying, all these external things, all these external factors are coming in, plot twists and obstacles and all that. But some of that can be all internal, right? You have your character arc is they're thinking about whatever's happening, or they're dealing with something, and that might be internal dialogue or process that's going on in their head, and that itself is complexity.
Yes. And I, again, can't track that very well just by reading it. So I create a storyboard for the character and their evolution through the book. And I start out with, basically I use my Post-it notes and I write down what's the main question this character has at the beginning of the book about their life. And then at the end of the book, how are they answering that question? Or what's the question that comes from that they still haven't answered? And then sometimes after I've created the draft, my first draft or second draft, I'll actually write a little sticky for every change point that the character goes through, and then track it backwards. So I start with that end point and see if the post-it before it, the moment before it in the character's inner life, actually earns out that next one, and so forth. So you're going backwards through the book to try to see if this character tracks. Boy, I've caught so many of my mistakes that way, where the character has something going on. It's just
so you'll arrange, instead of having a plan for the whole thing, you'll have a plan for each individual. That's a really interesting, and that makes a lot of sense, because then the interplay between them, you kind of have to scan over that. Whereas if you're doing something overall for the whole project, it must be very easy to miss those out.
It's totally easy. And I've done it myself. I've seen so many of my students do it. So I thought there's got to be a better way. And this is where I came up with, just break them into individual narrators or individual people, even if they're not a narrator, and see if I can track them through the book. So I don't know. It might not work for everybody. I'm pretty, obsessive about these things, because I've written and published a lot, and I just really feel like I want to make it work for the reader. I don't want them to have to struggle to figure out what this person's doing in the story and what they're going for, and where are they, why are they in this scene, so everything has to make sense, and this is how I do it.
Right.
So how many, like, you can't do that for absolutely everybody who's involved in it, surely, but so how do you differentiate between who needs their own individual sort of plan and who could just go along for the ride?
Well, that's a really good question. I usually have no more than 7. I know this is going to knock some people over, but I have no more than 7 people that I do this for, because I figure that the reader can't track more than 7 people, invest in more than 7 people. So I do it for my main characters. I have 3 narrators, meaning they all have point of view chapters in this new book that I've just published. And so I have 1, 2, 3, and then I'll have the main kind of satellite people right around them. And so I end up with about 6 or 7 people that I'll track, and not all of them have complicated stories, so they're kind of supporting cast, but some of them are really important, and they reveal things. They have a secret that they reveal, like in the last part of the book, and so I have to kind of make sure that that secret is planted in the earlier chapters, so that when it's revealed, it's not like a, wait a minute, where did this come from, for the reader. So I don't think 7. I think 7's the max I'll ever do.
I think that's a good writing. I mean, you think of like Friends has 6 characters. How I Met Your Mother has 6 characters. Frasier has like 5 characters. Like that number of characters is a good manageable one to actually get invested in across a story.
Yeah, you can't do. I don't believe a reader can do more than that. And I've been kind of trying to track this for years. Some books, like Lauren Groff is a really popular writer in the States, and she, of course, is she's got like crowds of people, but I find that I'm tracking just a certain number. I'm not going for everybody, because I can't as a reader.
Yeah, and I mean, even as a writer, I don't know how. So, for example, George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones, every reader in there is a complex reader with a massive arc, and there's so many of them, and then and I don't know how he keeps track of it. Never mind. I mean, maybe that's why it's taken him 10 years and he still hasn't put out another book. But but like personally as a reader, it is difficult to say, okay, now we're back to talking about this person. What was their deal again? It's and especially because it could be like many chapters since you even talked about them, maybe even a book, and then they come back in, and then you're like, oh, who was he related to? And
exactly. Yeah. And so it's hard, and I'm not a Martin kind of writer, so I don't have that kind of saga, but I still have complexity, because I got 3 main characters and they alternate chapters, and so I have to make sure that the thing that they were doing in the chapter that they showed up before is going to carry over, and that they influence the chapters in between, so people don't forget about them. And it's hard. It's hard. I don't know that complicated scenes are for everybody.
It's so satisfying when a writer pulls it off, though. I mean, this is going to sound like a stupid example. I know you write literary books with thriller beds. I watched Zack Snyder's cut of Batman or the Justice League or something, but they managed to make the aeroplane have a character arc in that special one, and I was like, that's amazing. And I found that really satisfying. It's so interesting talking to you and listening to how you have arcs and changes for all your characters. And I think when you read a book where even a character on the periphery who maybe is like not the focus of it still manages to go through character growth, that to me like defines a well-written book.
Yeah, I feel like that's a marker for me. If I can get to that point, then I'm satisfied and I'm ready to send it on to my agent or whoever. And I really feel like there's a moment where I think I got it, and then I haven't done that last check, and then I'll go ahead and do that last check, that verification, and find the holes. Stupid stuff like I dropped in my first book, I dropped one of the minor characters who was the hopeful boyfriend of the main character. I just dropped him. And my agent said, well, wait a minute, this guy Chad just disappears. What happened to him? So that's the kind of thing I've learned the hard way as a writer. You know, I don't want Chad to disappear. People invested in him, and then all of a sudden he's gone. So
that's great advice as well.
And Roland has his classic example of doing that in his series, where he changed the main character didn't have a brother, then he did have a brother. What was it?
Oh, so yeah, my first book in my series, I came up with a wonderful bad guy who ended up being there for all 12 books in the series. And he had a really evil brother who was delicious to write in the first book. And then book 9, I went to revisit, and I realized every other book I'd called him an only child. And I was like, what am I? So I was able to like retcon it effectively through some unreliable narration. But I mean, that's basic stuff, and readers do pick up on it. Sometimes I think as a writer, especially when you start off in self-publishing, it's very easy to think, oh, well, because you might not think of yourself as like a George R.R. Martin or Stephen King or something, but actually the people who take the time to invest in reading your book do care, and they do get invested in these characters. You have a responsibility as a writer to do the best you can to make everything come together effectively, and the way you describe it, that just shows like that I'm getting a lot out of listening to you that I will in turn add to my own writing process.
I also have a YouTube channel where I teach all this stuff. So if anybody's interested, they can just Google me and get the YouTube channel. And there's like 4 videos or something about how to do this storyboarding stuff. I've taught it for so long, you know, it's just so ingrained in who I am as a writer, but I know not everybody has the patience to do it this way. They like the flow, right? The flow writing, and the joy of that is so fun.
Well, okay, so we talk about like plotters and pantsers all the time, and obviously it sounds like you're far more of a plotter, right? But a lot of the times when we talk about that, we talk about the idea of plotting out the novel itself. So in chapter 1, this is going to happen. Chapter 2, this is going to happen, right? But from what you're describing, you're almost like charting out sort of what the arc of the story is, then what the arc of this character is, then what the arc of that character is, and so on. And then you somehow blend that all together. Are you plotting out, chapter by chapter or scene by scene, or do you just plot out those arcs and then sort of pants it from there, knowing all that information?
Yeah, totally. I can't stand it after a while. So what I do is the initial brainstorming for the book I'll do on a storyboard, and then I'll create all these ideas and put them on the wall and get all the sticky notes together and see how it works. Then I sit down and I start to draft, and it's kind of like a NaNoWriMo experience. I just go for it, and I write the worst stuff in the world, and I get it all out there. Sometimes 60, 70,000 words of really drivel. And then I'll go back to the storyboard and see, am I still writing the same book? First of all, could be completely different. If I like the new version, then I'll go back to the storyboard and redo the storyboard, or I'll go back to the draft and redo the draft. And I try to make them as matched as possible. And then I go back and forth between the two. So I think I'm half and half, because I can't not do the pantser stuff. That's the fun. And the plotting, I mean, I'm not an outliner. I have to do it by storyboard, because then I can move stuff around. I found with outlines, it kind of got solid in the computer, this has to come after this. And it just didn't work for me. I'm too much of an intuitive writer to go for that. So half and half, I think, Craig.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, I think that is a good way to do it, because sometimes, even as more of a plotter myself, I do end up changing things, and then it's like, okay, now do I go back to my my plan and so, and then re-edit that or whatever. But I still feel like I need the direction. I don't want to paint myself into a corner, so to speak, right? Whereas I think that would happen if I was just bare pantsing it. And I was like, oh, just start writing, right? And then I'm gonna be like, okay, first of all, forget half the things I did, but then by the end, I'll be like, okay, where am I going with this, and what, what's the ending, or now I can't do the ending I thought I was gonna do because I didn't do, So I think that the idea of having all those arcs, they can guide you to pants without having to worry about sort of putting yourself in a position that you can't get out of, or that you're gonna have to rewrite everything to get out of.
Because the pantsing brings in an element that I don't think I can get from the plotting. There's this intuitive element where I'm surprised again by the story, like I said earlier, and I only get that when I'm actually doing the flow writing and going places I wouldn't necessarily go that aren't on my map. And I find something there, and if I can find something valuable, I can bring it back into the plot. But that kind of sidetrack is so fun and so important in my writing process. I really need to do that because that's the inner side of the character that gets developed usually during that pantsing part.
It's you keep mentioning the word flow, and that's absolutely true. I think scientists said like the only time all 5 of those chemicals like serotonin and oxytocin and dopamine and stuff, the only time they all get released is when you're in the flow state. And that's why it's like, I don't know, I always say it's like talking to God on the telephone or something, or receiving a radio signal. And there is so much that you find out about these characters that you've created that you wouldn't have done if you just tried to plot it out. It's bizarre. Sometimes you read back what you've written after going through a flow state for a while, and you're like, wow, this is good. Who wrote this? I can't have written this.
I know. I'm reading some of my older stuff going, really? Wow, I wrote this? This is so cool. So, it's almost like an out-of-body experience for me, but I really need it to balance out the superstructure. I think both of them are important, so.
Yeah, no, for sure they are. But, I think being able to combine all that stuff as you pants is probably the skill that you have from doing it for a long time that other people might have trouble with, right? So it's you're arcing all that stuff, and you're not plotting it out. So then you go to start writing, and then you want to create that complex scene. So now you're sort of having to refer to 5 or 6 different storyboards almost to sort of pull them all together, right?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's not for everybody, but it does make me work better, and I think I can produce a successful novel that way. Maybe it's my recipe training. I like the whole listing stuff that's going to be on the recipe. In the recipe, I have everything measured out on the table and put it together. That's how chefs do recipes. They have the mise en scène, which is basically all the little bowls and stuff of the chopped garlic, and they all put it together at the cooking point. And that's kind of what I'm doing, I think. I never thought of it that way until this discussion.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, a skill that people might have to figure out for themselves. It might not always work exactly the same way if they don't have, chef experience. But do you have any sort of tips on how they can sort of pull all that complexity together into a scene and not have it sort of unravel, fall apart? Or
well, you have to be willing to back away from the scene and give it some distance, maybe set it aside for a week or so and give it a little bit of breathing room. And then you come back to it and you see it differently. I think the other way I find those errors is to read it out loud. I know lots and lots of writers who do this. And the auditory comprehension versus the visual is so different. So you're reading it for not only the pacing and the flow and the rhythm of the scene, but you're also reading it for, oh my God, I forgot this part. Or, oh my God, I dropped in something that wasn't set up. So I think, backing away, giving it a little rest, and then reading it out loud is the things I usually do to catch myself if I'm not storyboarding. Storyboarding for me is the best method I've used, but those two also work really well.
And then if you're, when you're doing your storyboarding, you have, I guess, all those sticky notes, and as you sort of use them, are you sort of pulling them down or so that you know, okay, I've done that, and sort of putting them aside.
Yeah. Like, where should this fight scene be? Well, I originally have it in the beginning. Or like in my current novel, the ones just got published, I had a plane crash, right? The protagonist crashes her little plane. And I had that in chapter 5. And I thought, what am I waiting for? Why not just start with this? So I moved my sticky from chapter 5 to chapter 1. And I thought, well, what if I started with the plane crash? What would have to happen after that? It all fell together. And I hadn't needed those 4 chapters. Like I said, those are my warm-up chapters. So that's the kind of thing I discover. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I remember writing a book and like cutting out the first 15,000 words because of exactly the same thing. It's like you're building yourself up, but you realize readers let you go. And what an opening, a plane crash as an opening of a book. What an exciting way to do it.
Oh, I'm telling you, the response I've gotten has been fabulous. So I don't know anything about flying, right? My mom was a pilot. So I was inspired to write a book about women pilots, but I had to go and research this. And this is one other thing I wanted to add in about complex scenes. Usually, if possible, the writer will be challenged by the material and have to go learn something. So I had to learn about search and rescue, ground operations, and flying for this book. And it was fabulous because my freshness about the topic, I think, infused the book with some freshness. So if you're writing about something you know really well and you've written about it 100 times, it may not come across as complex because you're not going to, I don't know, you're not going to approach the material as freshly as I had to with this, the plane crash. I've never crashed a plane, who would want to research a book? So
that's quite a lot of research. Maybe.
So, like, I took flying lessons. I did that, but I didn't crash a plane.
Yeah, I mean, so when you look at these scenes, like you're saying, sometimes it's hard to tell from your own perspective. Are you using beta readers or something like that to sort of give you some feedback on that?
Oh yeah, I have a crew, a poor beleaguered crew. They get every book. My writers group, I have five people that I asked usually to beta read for me, and they're honest. And they're not related to me, which is a really good thing because I found people related to me. Forget it. So I do have really good readers, and they tell me early on in the process when I've gotten to the point where I'm sick of it and I can't think of anything more to do, and I've done all my double checks as best I can, then I give it to my beta readers, and then I get a whole slew of stuff to correct and refine, which is so important. I think beta readers are wonderful, overworked people.
And that's actually a really good segue into the question of, right, you have plotted out your book, you've written your book, and then you've revised it and edited it. When you get those feedbacks and you go back and have to return, how does that impact the complexity of the scenes you've created?
Oh, it always brings in more. Oftentimes beta readers catch me on timing. So the timeline is off in some way, like 3 weeks happened and then 2 weeks happened. And, so they make me do things like plot out the timeline, and then they'll catch things like, the evil brother in your example, Roland, the color of the car, Fiat that's red in one chapter and a blue Chevy in another. So they catch all these things that I've missed, continuity. And I feel like without their eyes on it, I would miss all that stuff. Even though I've read it to myself, I've done my wall storyboard. It's just, you get blind to your own stuff.
I had a beta reader who pointed out that my heroine in one of my romance stories had removed her panties twice.
Well, maybe she had 2 pairs.
Yeah, and you sometimes have to, I think we've talked about this with some other authors where you almost have to create like a character sheet for everybody so that you can keep track of their hair color and their eye color and their whether they have brothers and sisters and all that stuff. And especially if you're writing a series, from one book to another, it could be a long period of time before you revisit it, and you're not necessarily going to remember all that stuff, right? But if you've kept it all in these character sheets, it's just, you don't have to go back and read the book again to say, okay, what color were their eyes? You can just refer to that and have all that information there. So I think that's probably pretty useful for this kind of thing as well.
I think a master sheet of information about all your characters and about your plot and your setting. I draw a map of my setting. I know this is going to be over the top for a lot of people. I draw a map of my setting and then an interior map of the main building that the story takes place in. And I've caught myself so many times about, having them be eating in the dining room at this end of the house with the sun coming in. I mean, a beta reader once caught me the character was walking outside as the moon was rising. And this beta reader actually went to the almanac, charted that day in history, and found out what time the moon rose, and it was wrong. So I had to go in and change. I mean, who would care? But they did. They did.
That's quite flattering that they would pay that much attention to it.
I suppose.
Yeah, your beta readers are the next level.
Yeah, they're really great. I won't trade them for anything. They're wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so that sort of thing, I think in different genres too, there's different levels of what you want to pay attention to. And sometimes if you're writing, a thriller or a mystery, I think having a lot of those details are, a lot more important than if you're writing, say, a romance or, something that, those kind of details aren't usually as important. But you still want to have the complexity in other things, especially character, and that's one of the big things with romance. Often there's that sort of the conflict between the two causing the breakup, and then the internal conflict making them change, become a better person, etc., right? But they don't necessarily have as many plane crashes and other external things. So yeah, I think what people take from this, I think, is dependent on sort of the genre that they're writing and the kind of book that they're writing. But there's always going to be a place to create the complex scenes, and that adds a lot of depth to a book. And it's something that, no matter what genre you're writing in, it's not something you want to ignore, right? Because if it's all just flat and or if it's not unique and everything's sort of like formulaic, it's not going to be memorable. Nobody's going to come back for book 2 or for the next book that you write. So it's so important to do all these things.
It is. And I think one of the big compliments you get as an author that you guys probably got is people recommending your book to others. And so they won't do that. They don't do that. Their recommendations on the line, they're not going to do that if there's iffy structure or the characters aren't engaging or they don't change enough or something like that. So I think, we're doing it for our readers. We're doing it for our own satisfaction, but we're doing it for our readers. I want to be proud of my books 10 years from now. That's my big goal.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, that's one of the biggest ways that books take off and become hits is when they're recommended to people by their friends and family, right? If nobody talks about your book, you're going to spend a lot of money on marketing, and you're always going to be every reader you get is from that marketing, because it's not going to ever go viral. Nobody else is going to pick it up and be like, hey, read this.
That's right. Right.
So when you are you good? So you had mentioned that people were asking for a sequel. Are you going to write a sequel to this one?
I have an idea. I've actually outlined it, and my agent said this would be great. Do it. But you know what? Maybe you don't have this, but when I publish a book, I have this kind of relaxation period I need afterwards, a little rest after all the marketing. And I have another one coming out in spring, which was written in tandem with the one that's out now. So two right in a row is a big deal. I think I'll pause a little after that. And yes, I'm probably gonna explore it. So many people have asked. I thought, well, gosh, there's an audience out there for the next idea. So, and
I guess one of the things is like, so especially if you're not planning to write a sequel when you first write the book, right? Yeah. And you've created all these arcs for all these characters, and they've changed and they've met their goals, and then you want to go back and write another book with a lot of those same characters. You have to almost now come up with these new arcs, new changes that they have to go through, right? Which is probably harder.
Well, that's why I think I said earlier that I like to leave things unresolved, and in some way I like to wrap up the plot so that's satisfying for the reader, but leave the characters' inner life a little unresolved, like they still have stuff that they're not completely 100% about. And I know that certain genres won't fit this, like romance probably wouldn't fit this, but in literary thrillers, there's still the idea that the characters, yes, they've survived this crazy thing that you know, and the killer is caught and all that stuff, but they still have some things that they're not resolved about. And so that creates the next book if I want to do it. I'm convinced after these interviews I've been doing, I don't know, maybe most people are asking me about a sequel, and I'm seriously considering it now. So I'll blame it all on you guys.
Give the people what they want.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, so I mean, listen, I think that that's the kind of thing that, you know, if you're writing a book to be part of a series, you're sort of taking that chance that people will love the first book enough to want to even read it, and you've sort of committed yourself often, because you do leave certain things unresolved. And then if nobody wants to read the book, then you're kind of like, well, do I write book 2 and you know, close off those loose ends? But you know, when you're not necessarily planning it, then I guess, and people are asking for it, then, you know,
that's good, huh?
Time.
That's good.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
I can write that on my resume.
Yeah, I mean, you can put the long-awaited and asked for follow-up to yeah.
Okay.
So we're approaching the top of the hour, but I was going to ask you, as a sort of a wrap-up question, you've written 12 books and you've been very successful with them. How has your evolution as a writer, and specifically this whole idea of plotting out, you know, the character arcs and stuff, how has that developed from the first book you wrote to the most recent book you wrote, and the book hopefully you'll write as a sequel?
It's a great question. The most important thing I've learned is to take my time, because the earlier books were all on deadline. They were, you know, contracted out, and I felt like I needed to take as long as it took with this one. And I'm not ashamed to say this one took 10 years. So I guess I fall into the George R.R. Martin category. But I needed that much time to develop the complexity of this plot and research plane crashes and search and rescue operations and really get good at that. And I wanted to make sure that those characters were trackable. And that's the thing I didn't have in the beginning. So I've developed patience with my own writing process and not angsting over the fact that I'm not making some artificial deadline. So I'm really glad. I'm very proud of it, and I'm very happy that readers are loving it. So that's the thing I want. I wanted that more than anything, you know, that feeling of success via the reader feedback.
I think that's what we're all chasing, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think we're into that.
Well, we have pretty much approached the top of the hours, but thank you so much for joining us. I personally have found so much value in listening to you, and there's a lot that I'm going to take to my own writing, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. How can people find out more about you, more about your books and things like that? Where can they go? My
website, marycarrollmoore.com, 2 R's, 2 L's, and 2 O's. That's the main place to go.
We'll pop a link down to that down below, but where else?
Oh, good. Excellent. So I'm on all the online booksellers, you know, bookshop.org, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, every place like that. I also have a Substack that I write every week. It's free, and it's been going on for 20 some years, and I have lots and lots of followers around the world. The URL for that would be marycarrollmoore.substack.com, and it's called Your Weekly Writing Exercise. So I give these kinds of tips that I shared today. Every week I do an article about some tip that I'm using and interview different writers. So that would be something that your listeners might enjoy.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mary. Do you have any final thoughts, Craig?
Well, like you, Roland, I've really taken a lot from this. I think I like the idea of creating those arcs to sort of do the plotting part of it without sort of plotting every individual sort of chapter and scene, and that might be something I want to try myself. So so thanks for suggesting that. But yeah, I think there's a lot for everyone here. So you know, I want to thank you again for coming on and giving us your time and talking to us.
It was fun. You guys asked great questions.
Oh, well, if you've enjoyed what Mary had to say, make sure you go down to the comment section, leave a comment to let her know that you valued everything she shared with us today. While you're down there, don't forget to hit that like button, that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. So until then, cheerio.